welcome to another episode of Courageous Conversations about our schools. This is your host, Ken Futernick, and today my guest is Shelby Rideout, whom you'll meet in just a moment. If you've listened to our podcast, you know it's about having better and more productive conversations about school matters, matters that are often fraught with controversy. We've also been focusing lately more and more on how students interact with one another, both inside and outside the classroom. The heightened conflict and polarization we're seeing across the country among adults is also happening among our youth, in large part because of social media and the extraordinary amount of time kids spend on their devices. That's something that should concern all Americans, I think, because it's fueling the rapid rise in mental health issues, including what some have called an epidemic of loneliness. That in turn has contributed to soaring rates of absenteeism in schools, and it interferes with students' ability to learn. In the last episode, we featured a program called Breaking Down the Walls. It's a highly successful program that gets high school students talking to one another and to classmates oftentimes they've never spoken to. The walls come down when they start sharing stories about themselves and begin to see one another as humans who share much in common. Well, today my guest, Shelby Rideout, is going to share a successful in-the-moment strategy that she's used when her students get trapped in messy conflicts. Her story and this strategy was featured in a People magazine in an article also in USA Today, which is how we heard about Shelby in the first place. Shelby, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ken. It's great to be with you.
So before you tell us about that strategy, just tell us a little bit about yourself, where you live and what you do.
I live in Nashville. I have 4 kids, 2 dogs, and a husband. I got my degree in education at Vanderbilt University many, many years ago in special ed and also elementary ed. But after graduation, I moved to New York to be an actress, which was always the plan. But I was always working with children. And to be honest with you, I'm a far better educator than I am an actress, but I had a fun time doing that. I went back, got a degree in sign language interpreting because that's what I had specialized in with special ed. And in 2015, I created a program called Bright Signs Learning that involves my puppet, Polly, there's his feet, that teaches young children 6 months to age 4 communication and reading skills, like really young, but using sign language.
Oh, wow.
And now I freelance, substitute, and interpret just as I'm needed at home as well. So,
Yeah. Well, terrific. There's probably a lot we could talk about with that also, but we're going to talk about the conflicts that kids get into that if you're an educator or a parent, you certainly encounter this all the time. And I just thought before we have you share a way that you've learned to respond to conflict, I was thinking about how we often respond to conflict, and I wonder if you can, maybe between you and myself, we can recall and the ways that we often respond when kids are in conflict with each other, what we often are inclined to say.
Time permitting, when you're in a classroom situation or even home with your kids and you're in the middle of doing something else, it's very easy. We've all done it. Knock it off, quit it, or go to your room, and you sort of don't deal with the problem other than say, knock it off or stop, send them to the room where they're not really dealing with the problem.
Yeah, I know myself, having, been an elementary teacher, I taught in high school. I don't know that it ever came up in my 20 some odd years teaching at the university, but you say, go work it out, or you'll say to someone, if you heard something that someone said that was inappropriate, you say, I want you to apologize, which, if you do get an apology, it's usually not heartfelt, and the person receiving it doesn't usually hear it as heartfelt, but we often have to move on. We can't stop and always deal with it then.
Well, as you said, to say, go work it out. I love that, because working in elementary, we say, go work it out, but we're not giving them the tools of how to do that.
Yeah.
Good advice, work it out, but they need a little bit more, adults sometimes too, of, well, what do I do to work it out?
Yeah, that's right. And there were times when I was teaching many years ago when I would send a couple of kids outside and say, work it out. And lo and behold, once in a while, they'd come back in with the smiles on their face. I don't know what they did necessarily. And uh, but I think you're right, unless they have some tools to kind of figure it out. And that may be related to what you're going to talk about, because I think this questions or the response that you have in the moment is something that maybe kids could learn to do without having an adult around to guide them through this.
Right, right. Well, it's funny. It did. I had posted something on TikTok. I'm a Gen Xer, but TikTok has taken a liking to me. But my rule with TikTok is I only put out positive things. That's it. There's enough negative out there. And so I had posted a situation that had happened in a school I was working in, and these two students were getting into it in the hallway. We were kind of waiting for the bus. They line all the kids out in the hallway, and these two girls were just going at it. And I it was raising, the voices were raised. I came out, I said, what is going on here? And I was shocked to see the two girls that were involved, because both girls individually were really kind, sweet, lovely girls. And they were getting into it aggressively, calling each other names that were inappropriate and unkind. And I said, stop, stop, stop. What is happening? And they stopped. And I said, gosh, this is so uh, hard for me to believe, because we're I like both you girls. And so what we're going to do, I said, actually, what I said to them was, what happens when I go out in the world and I look for a problem? And they said, no, what happens? I said, I find one. Every time I look for a problem, I find a problem. I said, we're not going to do that. We're going to find common ground. So I said, I'll start. I said, you are so wonderful, Stella. I think you are a wonderful person, and you're really kind, and you always say interesting things in class, and I've seen the way you treat people, and it's really kind. And I said, and to the other girl, I said, same with you. I said, you're so fun and sweet and kind to your friends. I said, you guys have that in common. Mrs. Rideout thinks both you girls are just kind, lovely individuals. And so I said, is there anything else that we have in common? And Stella goes, I know something we have in common. I said, great, what? I don't even think I asked her. I think she on her own said, I know we have something in common. Jesus. And I said, now people have a lot of beliefs. So I looked at the other girl and she said, looked at Stella and she goes, yes, we have Jesus in common. Stella went on, I got another thing. I love Ethiopian food. And the other girl was Ethiopian. And I said, oh, you like Ethiopian food? She said, no, I don't, but I love the bread. The little girl says, it's called injera. And they had forgotten about looking for the problem. They then were just involved in almost a game of finding out what they did have in common. 10 minutes later, these girls were laughing and hooting and hollering in the hallway, and it was done. It was great. I was surprised how much attention it got, but we're living in a world where I think people are looking for problems and not common ground anymore. So it was sort of this revolutionary. Oh, how magnificent.
It sounds like this kind of thing could work in a case where the so-called problem they're dealing with was sort of manufactured. It was a symptom of something else, but there isn't really an issue to be worked out. And in that case, what happened is the in quotes problem just kind of dissolved away because it occurred maybe for reasons that had nothing to do with what they thought the problem was. And as soon as they realized they had a lot in common, it didn't matter anymore. Is that what you're finding, is that just changing the focus is what's going on here?
Well, and you think about, well, what causes us to argue with somebody or have conflict? And it's insecurity. It can be insecurity. It can be you feel threatened that their ideas are different than your ideas, which, again, as adults and as a culture in this country, we are really getting further and further away from understanding, oh, you can have a different idea than me, and we can still be really great friends. We can really actually exchange ideas and find out, oh, I see why you think that. And we've just gotten so far away from that we're threatened if someone has another way of solving a problem. What I realize in political conversations with people is usually at the root of it, we all want the same thing. So we all want to protect our children. We may have different ways in schools of how we feel best to do that. But we have to remember, okay, we all love children, or we want to keep our children safe, or we want them well educated. That's the basis. It's okay if we have different ideas of how we do that, remembering that our goal is the same. That's what's important. So it's the same, I think, with children in conflict and stuff. It's okay, insecurity, or, oh, I feel threatened that they have another idea than me, or I've taken something the wrong way. And once you sort of change the focus, as you said, onto something else, well, let's figure out, what do we do have in common? And there's something very safe in feeling that way. Oh, there's an understanding between us. And then you kind of go from there.
Amanda Ripley, who I've interviewed, she's a terrific expert on conflict. She has a book called High Conflict, and how we get trapped and how we get out. In that book, she talks about something she refers to as the understory. And she says in all cases of high conflict, and I don't know if what kids sometimes present to us in terms of conflict rises to the level of high conflict, but for them, and sometimes in that moment it is. And if you're a teacher, it's certainly at the very least a distraction. But she says the understory is often, and you alluded to it, it's often fear or respect or control or overwhelm, or some combination of those things. And it's not really the thing that is on the surface. And she says that one of the things that often can avoid that or get out of it is something that has been studied by many researchers called contact theory. And it's the idea of bringing people together and spending time talking about things that you have in common. And it's just, the idea of breaking bread together, or before we start in talking about our views about how we're going to teach, or how we're going to, where there could be differences, healthy differences of opinion, we're going to spend some time just interacting with each other. In that program I mentioned to you, Breaking Down the Walls, what they do is they get kids talking to each other about very, very simple things. And it turns out kids say, I ended up talking with, 10 kids today I've never even spoken to. I didn't even know who they were. And they're just talking about silly things. And it starts to break these walls down. They realize when they hear one another's stories, they have a lot in common. And then those other things that present as real problems, which are really manifestations of respect or control or fear or loneliness,
Mm-hmm.
they sort of dissolve away.
Yeah. Yeah. And in today's, you had mentioned in your intro about kids being on their devices as much as they are in this loneliness. As educators, it's really important that we keep trying to bring them back to connecting face to face, human to human, because they do spend so much time typing to one another, and there's no facial expressions, there's no like human to human contact of connecting. And so they're losing the skills, I believe, to do that effectively, because they're out of practice with it. So when you do that program is wonderful, getting kids to simply converse in a human way. It cannot be replaced. I don't care if you're connecting and you're typing, or you have to connect human to human.
Yeah,
I really believe that.
yeah. Your response to these two girls, and they went from going at each other to laughing, and it just seemed like it, it solved the problem. Were you able to follow their relationship, and were things better for 10 minutes, or were they better a week later?
Better. Just it just continued on that path. I feel like sometimes when we feel like we're on the same team as someone, when you have a class and then they go to gym and they're competing against another class, and all of a sudden it's like, we're in this together. We got to beat their class because it's like anything common like that. So these girls had, especially, there wasn't other people involved. It was just one-on-one, and they really connected on really some deeper issues, funny enough. And it can be something simple. These girls happen to connect on something deeper, Jesus for them, and then also something simple, a kind of food, which actually one girl didn't even like other than the bread. but it really took it to a deeper level. There was never an issue after that. And it was interesting how quickly they wanted to jump in and find common ground.
Mm.
I think partly also, and I'm not always successful at this, you'll see parenting experts and stuff say that, anytime I respond calmly to someone, it goes great, whether I'm responding to a student
Mm.
or my children. And sometimes life gets in the way and we say, stop it. But what only all that does is escalate. So I think part of what happened too was like, gosh, what's going on here? And just kind of responding, not at anger that they were having a conflict. It was more, we were getting off the conflict part. I'm not going to be angry about that. We're going to go to a happier place and we're looking for good things. So, but like I said, it's not always easy to respond that way, but giving them something to mirror as far as like, wait, we're just kind of letting the air out of the tires. This is
Yeah.
too high. We need to just bring it down in your voice and in the way in which you're communicating. And then they kind of follow suit. Like I said, I'm not always successful, but when I am, I said, boy, that really works.
No, it just reminds me of how we sometimes lose sight of our priorities. And as humans, we're not always rational, which is to say we don't act in ways that are consistent with what, if we really stop and think about it, what matters to us. At just recently was asked to go into a local church where they have a politically very diverse group of people. And they had asked me to help them figure out how to have conversations with each other or with their friends and relatives about politics when they disagree without it going off the rail. And so I began by having them think for a minute about the most important things in their life. What are those things, and where do their relationships with friends and relatives fit into that scheme? And as one would imagine, they were, for everybody in the room, was right at the top. I said, so if that's true, then we wouldn't want to do anything that would harm those relationships. And hopefully we would do whatever we could to strengthen our relationships with friends and family, not to mention, in some cases, strangers. And yet, we allow ourselves to get into conversations when we think the most important thing is being right, or how can they think that? And it ends up harming relationships to the point where over half of the people in the room raise their hand when I ask the question, how many of you have become estranged from a friend or relative in the last few years because of politics? I mean, that's how serious it's gotten, and nobody liked that. And that's kind of, I think, why they wanted to, one rational way out of that is just to avoid anything where you might disagree. The problem with that is that we're thinking about it. We know the other person's thinking about it. Is there a way to come together and listen to each other, maybe discover that you don't necessarily agree as much as you thought, or you really do disagree, but you're willing to put your relationship first and just say, I'm going to accept the fact that we don't agree on that, but I am a friend. We are related. That is more important than the other stuff.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a smart thing there too, was just saying, starting out with, how important what is your priorities? And they realize we share in that. Our priorities the same. So how are we going so far off our priority where we're losing relationships? If it's a priority, that means it's number one.
Yeah.
So if you're behaving another way, it's no longer number one. That's not a priority when you let it fall through the cracks like that. I think when we have young kids, a lot of it is modeling also. And like I said, in schools, there's been a lot of discussion about how we're not teaching free thinking. We're teaching them what to think. And that's a really dangerous place to go, because what we should be teaching is, I remember in high school, it was very lively of having discussions, but there were rules in which you abided by, respecting, and that has to be modeled in our classrooms. And if we're no longer allowing kids to really think and come up with their own ideas and share those ideas and have those ideas maybe not shared, but respected, or if we're not doing that, they're completely out of practice with it. And you do see this younger generation cutting people off from they don't believe what I believe. They're, unfriend me if you believe this and this kind of stuff. It's absolutely ridiculous. Like I said, I have 4 children. And when they were little, I said, you guys are going to have a lot of choices in life. But whether or not you guys are friends and get along with one another is not one of those choices. So I suggest you figure out things about one another that you like, because you're going to be with each other forever and you're siblings, and doesn't mean you can't disagree with each other. And I see parents who like, oh, my kids are so different. They don't have a relationship. I'm like, what? How are we just acquiescing to that just because they're different? My best friend, for me, she's very different, but we have a lot of common ground, and that's what makes our relationship so special. So to me, sometimes it's like you whether it's a classroom, not like we are Mrs. Rideout's classroom, and we are going to all respect one another and figure out things in which we have in common, and that's the joy in this class, is to be different but also respect each other, and realize that we're not as different as we think, you know.
Well, let's leave it there, Shelby. I want to thank you so much for being a guest on Courageous Conversations about our schools. I think people will appreciate the suggestion. As People Magazine called it, I'd sort of a hack, and I'm always suspicious of overly simplified hacks. But I think in this case, that kind of reset that you found has worked with a number of people, including your own kids, but many of your students, is something that people can take away, and something you can implement now. I mean, you could probably encounter this either with people that you know yourself that you're in conflict with, or the students that you're with that invariably find reasons to get in conflict with each other. And sometimes this simple reset of going to, let's just suspend this for a minute and identify the things that we have in common, can sometimes short circuit the whole thing and set people on a different path.
Yeah, I agree.
So thanks for being with us. Listeners out there, you can find this episode of Courageous Conversations at our website, schoolconversations.org, or wherever you find your podcasts. If you look up Courageous Conversations about our schools, you'll find this episode and all of our episodes there. So long, everyone.